Again, my name is Craig Willingham. I'm the Deputy Director here at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. We're a research and action center based here at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. We work on a wide variety of food policy related topic areas, everything from food insecurity to jobs in the food sector to the linkages between upstate producers and downstate consumers. And today we're going to be discussing food related spending in the city and state budgets for FY20 and exploring how the FY21 city budget might look in light of the recently released City Council Growing Food Equity Report. There are two central questions we hope to address today, and those are how do the New York City and state budgets process, and how do the processes engage with advocates? And we also want to discuss what sort of strategies are most effective in budgetary. I also wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. We have an upcoming forum on November 19th. This is a bit of a different forum for us. It is going to be at Parrot College, and it's in the evening from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., focusing on building businesses, bridges, urban-rural food dynamics. And I think for those of you who are interested in the ways in which there are many, many missed opportunities for the city, both the public and private sector, to boost production and support for upstate producers, this will be a really great forum to hear from people who are actually doing that work upstate, some of the farmers, and also to hear from buyers and vendors in the city who are looking to expand their capacity to bring in New York State products. So again, November 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Parrot College. And our forum in December, which will be part of our regular series here, we'll be focusing on 50 years of SNAP and looking at the ways in which SNAP has evolved over the last 50 years and taking particular note of what are the ways in which SNAP has been under threat over the last 3 or so years since the Trump administration has taken it upon itself to reform SNAP, as they call it, in ways that ultimately we view as detrimental. This coincides with the release of a special American Journal of Public Health issue focusing on SNAP, which has several really interesting articles looking not only at the history, but also, again, the current challenges and opportunities for SNAP. So I highly recommend attending that forum, and I hope to see many of you there. Lastly, I want to mention very quickly our report. For those of you who are subscribed to our newsletter, you probably received this yesterday. We produced a report looking at food and the New York City budget, a review and analysis of municipal budget allocations in fiscal years 2019 and 2020, where we sought to illuminate city and state budget processes for those looking to create healthier, more equitable, and sustainable food systems. We have a few paper copies here. Well, it looks like we have no more over there, but we had a few paper copies of the executive summary there on the table. Anyone interested in getting a paper copy, just see me afterwards and I can print one out for you. But it's also available on our website, both the executive summary and the full report. And lastly, I'll add that this will be part one of a two-part report, which will be released sometime in January or February, looking more specifically at the budget processes on the state. The first report was more of a hybrid approach, looking primarily at the city, but also at some of the state processes. So with that, I want to open the floor up for our speakers. We had biographical summaries of all of our folks who are speaking today, so I won't get too deeply into that. I'll just do some very brief introductions. Today we have Marissa Martin, Executive Director of the Advocacy Institute, James Parrot, Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, Liz Ackles, Executive Director of Community Food Advocates, and Claire Raffel, Deputy Director of the Laurium Tisch Center for Food, Education, and Policy Program in Nutrition at Teachers College, Columbia University. So I'd like to invite Marissa up to start.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on behalf of the Advocacy Institute to this event. So I am here to sort of dig into that first question about understanding the process. So I'm with the Advocacy Institute. We were founded in 2013, and we're committed to transforming the legislative landscape in New York for justice and dignity. And so this is our small but mighty team, and so the way that we do this is we deliver trainings and tools, we build networks and develop leadership in order for communities to win legislative campaigns and to build more power and organizing infrastructure along the way. The reason why we do this is that government is opaque, right? It's really hard to navigate. We think it's really important to go through the process step by step with folks so that you can sort of be ahead of the game. So we have a ton of subject matter experts here to talk about food policy. That is definitely not me, but I'm here to really talk about the process and how really being able to understand how it's broken down can help you be really effective advocates. There's a lot of different campaigns that go on, and if you have that expertise, but you enter into the process a little late, it could just mean that your campaign doesn't go anywhere, and it can feel really discouraging when you've done so much work. We also know that legislative goals require specialized abilities, really understanding not just the policy, but also the political, really understanding the landscape. So in the city and state, who's in power, who knows who is close to who really hates someone, and even though it doesn't make sense and they should work together, they may not, just for personal reasons, and understanding that can give you that power to push your campaign and to strategize. And then institutional memory is lost when teams use inefficient ad hoc tools for research and execution. So I worked at nonprofit organizations for a long time, working on policy and advocacy. And anyone here who's worked on a campaign, how many folks keep your contact information in spreadsheets? Right? Yeah, right? We have spreadsheets and we title them with different dates. And then, if we're lucky, we get someone to come on board and call every office each year to see if there's been change. Someone's chief of staff, tomorrow then becomes somebody's legislative director. So people move around a lot. And as nonprofit organizations, which, we really can be scrappy and can put things together, we don't have those tools. And so Advocacy Institute really looks at building out technology for nonprofits. So we created a legislative directory that has all of the contact information for New York City and state, as well as county legislature, because that information is public, but the government just makes it extremely difficult for you to have it and to actually be able to strategically look at it, right? So no one can build a campaign by going through each website and looking at, right, if you can look at a geographic map and see in this region, look at these folks, these are all folks who are sitting on the same committee, these are folks we want to work with, right? So we build tools in order to help folks do that, and I'll talk a little bit about one of our tools at the end of my presentation. And then advocates have a wealth of knowledge ready to be organized, modularized, and effectively shared. So that's what we have tried to do, is really think about each step of the process, how a bill becomes a law, how to understand the budget, implementation, which is absolutely huge nowadays, when we saw so much historical legislation pass on the state level last year. And so how can we come together and find common interests, find common priorities so that we can work stronger or work strongly together. So I'm just going to briefly, so as I said, we create tools. So while we have those interactive tools, we have workspaces for our member organizations to communicate with each other. We also create static maps, and that was sort of how we started it off. So this is our state level civic engagement timeline. As you see the big red arrow, this is where we are. Why this is important to know, right? So sometimes we pull this up and folks in our trainings are sort of like, we're a nonprofit, we don't want to talk about civic engagement and electoral things, right? We're a C3, and that's a whole nother module of our training that C3s can lobby, that you can do this work. That's for a different day. But this map is really to show you kind of what's happening throughout our 2-year legislative cycle. And so really understanding that wherever you enter, having like clear grounding of what you're doing and where you are is really important. So as we see, our legislative cycle is 2 years. So if you introduce a bill in 2018, it can have the same bill number through 2019, and then we have elections, right? And then you have to start again. And so really understanding that as you're developing your strategy is important because it is a 2-year game. Even though our budget is passed once a year, when you're trying to pass a bill, you have some time to really think through. And then thinking about electoral organizing and thinking about what you're up against. All of our elected officials have no term limits, and they work part-time, they're making $120,000 a year, and they're running for election every 2 years, right? So think about maybe having to like reapply in a competitive manner for your job every 2 years. And so as soon as the second year kind of hits, they're thinking about what do I'm trying to stay in office, right? And then there's rumors, things happen. So really having an understanding of this. It doesn't mean you need to get involved and get behind campaigns. I mean, folks do that and that's wonderful, but just understanding how you can engage with your elected official in a strategic manner, knowing all of this. And looking into 2020, which is going to be the legislative session year 2, with electoral organizing, we also know that there is the federal primaries, right? April 28th. We know it's the census day, April 1st. We know that it's the state primary day, June 23rd. There are so many other things that are happening. So if you're trying to push a bill through, being aware of that is very important, right? If you were to contact an elected official and be like, I would love to meet April 1st, right? That elected official will be like, don't you know there's this huge census push, millions of dollars are going out to groups to try and get folks enrolled, all of that. So these are things that even if it's not your core issue, having that understanding can help you stand out as an advocate as you're doing this work, and also really be strategic in your strategy and what you're doing. Another map we have here is our timeline map, and so this is for the state level. And so we always have a key which is kind of cut off from this map, apologies. Normally it's like printed out big and then there's details on the bottom, but what we have is the orange line represents the budget cycle, and the blue line represents the legislative cycle. And you'll see that there's different shades, and so the dark blue and the dark orange really show kind of the core times of when advocacy is really needed, and when these are the priority times that folks are in session. So the blue line from January to June, that is the required part-time allocation for our elected officials, our state assembly and state senate to be in session. And then the orange line, the dark orange line, is really indicating this is when the administration is really thinking about the budget, right, and really putting it together. James is going to probably dig into how all of that happens, how they think about revenue, and how they come to these. But starting in October, which we're at the end of, is when the agencies really have to put forth their budgets. So if you have something that you want done and shifted in agency policy, that's like in that light shaded orange line, that's when you start having conversations with folks, right? And that's when you sort of start to plant the seed and be like, what does your budget even look like? And then, a few minutes ago, James just mentioned the 2% spending cap that our governor has put on every single year. And so very often trying to have those conversations is hard because there is a spending cap. But it is, you wouldn't think, knowing that the session starts in January to June and you're working on a budget ask, you might think we should start talking to them in January. But there's actually a lot of work to be done. And so similarly, we have the city council map. You see the legislative session is a lot longer. They're working full time. The budget season, like the hot budget season, is January to June. There's a lot of different budget asks that you can have. There's the larger asks of the administration and changing policies and shifting it. There's bills that need to be passed, and there's also just individual organizations advocating for money for their own programs. So all of that is happening in June. And again, that light orange line is when you need to do the legwork to prepare yourself and your campaign to hit the ground running in January. And I will say just a general, rule of thumb is understanding the different power dynamics. Our budgets are always built by the executive. So the mayor and the governor build out the budget and propose it to the legislature. And so it's really driven by their priorities. And then when you think back to the legislature and you think about passing bills, that's all driven by the legislature and it's responded to by the executive. So really, again, understanding those power dynamics. If you have an awesome relationship with your legislature, try to go that way, right? If you have a terrible relationship with the governor, that might be where you want to go because then their votes and them passing a bill is the way to get it through. So, just kind of finishing up with effective strategies, it's really important to determine what your ask is. I know that when I had a conversation with Craig, really I looked through the speaker's report and all of his priorities, and really understanding which priorities he had. Administrative policies, where he was going to push, some of the agencies to do something. He had legislative priorities, where he was going to, or him and the legislature were going to introduce bills. And then there were some asks that said support, and that's something to be conscientious of and kind of push more. What does support mean, right? Support can mean really different things, and very often we allow our elected officials to off the hook because they're like, yeah, we support it. It's like, well, what is it? Are you sponsoring a bill? Are you going to talk to the mayor? Like, what is support, right? So really understanding what that is. Do your research. Are there other coalitions with a similar ask? Especially now at the state level, we have a Democratic Senate, Assembly, and governor. That doesn't mean that everything is going to pass at all. If anything, conservative Democrats are showing their faces more and more. People who voted for things in the Assembly for decades this past session didn't vote for them at all. And so really doing your research and then thinking about, are there other coalitions? What has been done in the past? What has been successful? How have things changed in the landscape that maybe if we do try this again, it could be successful? And then identifying strategic targets, talking to agencies. The largest thing about legislative advocacy is your goal is to change agency behavior, right? So even if you are doing council work, even if you are pushing an initiative in the council, what you want to do is think about the agency that is going to have to implement that and understand, are they going to be really against it, or are they totally down with it and they just want you to do the heavy lifting because they can't actually fight with their boss, who's the mayor, and push them to get more money, right? Again, understanding policy versus politics. So as we do this work, unfortunately, politics are something that are a reality and that we have to be aware of, right? In our city council in 2021, 36 council members are terming out and leaving. That means that we will have 36 brand new people, some who may have been staffers and some who may not be and might be grassroots organizers that have been working on our issues, which is awesome. And we have to understand how they know the process. And then don't forget about implementation. Again, like on the state level, it's really about making sure that you can understand who needs to implement this and make sure that you're staying on top of your campaign. So many bills pass where nothing is done, right? Countless bills pass, countless resolutions, and nobody follows up. And then finally, building relationships is number one to all of this work. And that is my time, so I will not go into this. But this is just our nice tool that helps you track a campaign. You can email me after, and I can share that with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Marissa. Since I took the Advocacy Institute's training back in June, I've been singing their praises ever since. And so for those of you who are interested in budget issues and budget advocacy, I highly recommend taking their training, reaching out to them. They provide lots of technical assistance, and for organizations, they're able to put together large-scale trainings for you and your staff. So a great resource. Next up, I'd like to welcome James to the stage. James Parrot, again, is the Director of Economic and Physical Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School.
Great. Thanks. Good morning. Good morning. Let's see if this is working. Okay. I work at the Center for New York City Affairs, and I follow city and state economy, city and state budgets, look at the impact of federal budgets on the city and the state budgets, and so on. I have a couple of slides on the revenue side of the city budget, so I'm going to go through those. I wasn't sure what else to say in terms of the revenue side. I do have sort of one important lesson that I'll get to in a minute on the revenue side, but I'd be happy to take any questions on the city or state revenue side or the impact of federal revenues. But then I also want to use this opportunity to talk about some things that I spent a lot of time on, working on labor standards and the impact of the minimum wage. And I think it's had a big impact in the restaurant sector, big part of the food sector in New York City. So I wanted to say a few words about that because there's been a lot of conflicting information out there about the impact of the minimum wage. So New York City budget revenues. So New York City's budget is big. It's like the 5th largest government budget in the United States after the federal budget, and then the budgets of New York State and California and Florida. So it's a large budget, and it's mostly funded locally. So 3/4 of the revenues spent in the city budget come from either taxes or from fees and fines levied locally. Taxes comprise about 2/3 of that. The city budget has about 25% of its revenues come from state and federal aid. And within that slice of the pie, 2/3 of that is from the state budget. And about 9% of the city's revenues overall come from the federal budget. 9% of $90 billion for fiscal 18, which is now a couple of years behind, but this is the latest year that we have this sort of more comprehensive data from the Independent Budget Office, is a good chunk of money. So it's important to sort of keep an eye on what's happening at the federal budget level because it might have an impact on New York City. But even more important than that is what happens in the state legislative session in terms of the state budget and how that affects New York. And what we've seen in recent years is that the governor, who, as we know, doesn't get along that well with our mayor, has made changes in the state budget in many ways that sort of come at the expense of the city budget. And then that displaces more expenses down to the city level, which the city budget then has to figure out how to accommodate. So that's something important to keep an eye on. The city economy is in the midst of an unprecedented period of economic growth and employment growth. And because we have a fairly diversified local tax structure, we've had pretty consistent and strong local tax revenue growth that has helped made possible growing spending in the city budget. On average, for the past 5 years, total tax revenues have increased a little over 5% a year. So this has made possible a lot of additional spending. We haven't had any tax rate increases at the city level in recent years, and yet we've been able to spend quite a bit more each year. Each 1% growth in taxes translates into $600 million. 5% is $3 billion. So for the last few years, city spending has been increasing on average $3 billion a year, or close to that. The largest tax revenue source for the city is the property tax. We get about 45% of taxes from the property tax. And the property tax has been growing above average in recent years. And this is again, no tax rate increases, but a reflection of increased real estate values and increased assessments generating more more property tax collections for the city. The second largest source of revenue is the personal income tax, and that's followed by the sales tax and a set of business taxes, the corporate income tax and the unincorporated business tax. It used to be that the business taxes generated more revenue than the sales tax. That situation has reversed in recent years, as you can get a sense of from this chart showing, slightly positive average growth in the business taxes in the last 5 years. In a period when the economy has been doing pretty well. So have corporate profits been suffering over this period? Have hedge fund and private equity fund profits been suffering over this period? Not exactly, but they're managing to limit their tax payments to the city nonetheless. And sales tax growth, meanwhile, has been about 4% a year. The city, as I said before, has a very diversified tax base and a fairly diversified economy, and it's probably gotten more diversified in recent years. For the last, for the last several business cycles, economy goes through up and down swings. The city's economy has been heavily influenced by what's happened on Wall Street. Wall Street is still a big factor in the city economy. It's not as dominant as it was before the 2008-2009 financial crash in terms of driving employment and total spending in the city economy. We've had strong growth in the tourism sector, in the tech sector, in arts and entertainment, in higher education, continued growth in the healthcare sector, and so on. Many other parts of the city economy have been doing well, and Wall Street is by no means suffering, but it just hasn't been the dynamic engine that it was in previous periods. Now, one important takeaway from this is that if you're advocating for a new program that involves spending at the city level, don't be deterred by legislators who say, well, how are you going to pay for that? That's a way of their saying, I'm not really interested in supporting your proposal. Because with revenue growth like what we've seen in recent years, even a 1% growth in taxes translates into $600 million more a year. You're probably not talking about initiatives that are going to cost, scores of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. So that just the growth, the expected annual growth in the economy and tax revenues allows the city a lot of latitude in terms of funding new initiatives. Let me digress and say something about the property tax. There's the property tax system in New York City is very regressive. It's the largest contributor to the fact that the local taxes that are under local control to some extent, property tax, the income tax, personal income tax, and sales tax, are overall very regressive, meaning that high-income people pay a lower percent of their income in local taxes than middle and lower-income people. Property tax is a good reason for that. There are a lot of inequities in the property tax that have worsened over the last 4 decades since the last significant reform. The city's property tax is really set at the state level. There's the mayor and the speaker appointed an advisory commission on property tax reform. I'm fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your perspective, to be on that property tax reform commission. This, I think, is a unique opportunity to make the city's tax system less regressive. We're not going to quite get to the point where we make the property tax system progressive, but we can do, there are various things we can do to make it a lot less regressive and to benefit low and moderate income families in New York City. We will need support in Albany to get that passed, and that hopefully will be a big issue in the legislative session in 2020. That's just a chart showing the regressivity of the city's local taxes. Let me talk about the minimum wage for a couple of minutes. We are in the midst of an historic increase in the minimum wage in New York City. This chart shows that it's more than doubled since 2013, from a period when we were at the same $7.25 federal minimum wage level to now we have a minimum wage for large employers of 10 or more employees of $15 an hour. This has had a big impact in lifting wages and incomes in the bottom half of the income distribution. 38% of all workers are affected directly or indirectly by the minimum wage. So this has been a very positive, steady declines in the poverty rate. Child poverty in New York City has declined by 6 percentage points in the last 5 years since the minimum wage has been going up. This has been a big issue in the restaurant sector. The restaurant sector is the largest employer of low-wage workers. Almost 80% of all restaurant workers are affected directly or indirectly by minimum wage. Many in the restaurant sector claim that the minimum wage increase is creating real problems for restaurants, and that anytime a restaurant goes out of business, you know, there are representatives of the restaurant groups who say, well, it's because of the increase in the minimum wage. So we did a report at the Center for New York City Affairs together with the national colleagues at the National Employment Law Project to investigate this. And what we found was that restaurant employment growth was very strong in New York City, much stronger than at the national level. We looked at employment growth in restaurants compared to 12 large cities that had no increase in the minimum wage in the last 5 years. And generally, employment growth was faster in New York City. And employment growth has been particularly fast in limited service restaurants, fast food restaurants in New York City, which you're probably paying attention to this very rapid growth in fast casual restaurants. So a lot of people are employed in that sector. Their wages are generally pretty modest, around $25,000 a year for a full-time restaurant worker. Altogether, there are about 250,000 restaurant workers in New York City. And this growth in restaurant employment has accounted for 1 out of every 10 new jobs in the city's economy in the last 5 years. This is my last slide, and I'll wrap up. There's a wage board that the governor's appointed at the state level that's looking at it's considering whether or not to eliminate the tipped credit for the minimum wage, which allows restaurant employers to pay a sub-minimum wage to restaurant workers as long as their tips, together with the sub-minimum wage that the restaurants pay, bring them up to $15 an hour. 7 states, including California, Oregon, Washington, and Minnesota, don't have a tip minimum credit, and yet their restaurant sectors are as vibrant as they are in New York or other places where they do have the tip credit. Waiters and waitresses who rely on tips do as well in those states as they do in New York City. So there's support among a good part of the restaurant workforce to eliminate the sub-minimum tip credit. And we think that is a good public policy direction to go in, and it will lessen the extent of harassment that restaurant workers are subject to, and it will help more restaurant workers rise above the poverty level. In states that don't have a tip minimum credit, poverty is less severe among restaurant workers. Thank you.
Do we want to take a question or hold the question? Okay.
Thank you, James. I know I have lots of questions after that. Very interesting, and I think understanding the revenue side is important to making a compelling argument for any sort of budget advocacy that an organization wants to do. Next up, I'd like to welcome Liz Ackles from Community Food Advocates. Liz is going to talk a little bit about their success in pushing for universal school lunch and how that was connected with budget advocacy. So Liz, if you can come up.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Good. So as Craig mentioned, I'm Liz Ackles, the Executive Director of Community Food Advocates, and I'm here to talk about the campaign that we spearheaded and continue to push along called the Lunch for Learning campaign for universal free school lunch. And I hope there are lessons from our experience that might be helpful to folks that are interested in doing budget-based policy change. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on the why school food, why do we focus on school food, and then talk a little bit about the why universal, and then strategically what the opportunities were and how we got things done. So the reason for school food, and probably lots of people in the audience here know this, but school food reaches 900,000 students a day with a combination of breakfast and lunch. About 650,000 students eat lunch every day, about 200 or so thousand eat breakfast. It reach is enormous. I think probably the furthest reach for an anti-hunger program for households with school-age children that's available. There's an infrastructure in every neighborhood, in every school, and it's mostly federally funded. So that's some of it. Why universal free school lunch? When I started at Community Food Advocates in 2013, most of my background had been around public benefits work, around food stamps and welfare advocacy. I learned from our founders who had been fighting for universal free school lunch for 30 years, all of the impact. So 75% roughly of New York City public school students are eligible for under the federal criteria of free and reduced price lunch. So I thought this was astonishing because that's for a household of 3, less than $38,000 a year in New York City in 2019. So almost by definition, most families and most children who are in New York City public schools those families are struggling to make ends meet. If a child eats school lunch and school breakfast every day during the school year, on average, that's 40 meals a month. For households who are struggling financially, that is a very significant impact on the child's nutrition, first off, and secondly, on the household budget. So like Robin Hood Foundation a while ago did an estimate of how much it costs to send a child with a well-balanced meal to school if a parent was providing it, and it was roughly $5 a day. So if you estimate that out over the school year, that's $900 a year. Again, given household income of students in public schools, that's pretty significant. The other reason that we focus on universal free school lunch is that the poverty stigma around the program, which is a remnant of the way for decades the federal reimbursement structure has worked and divides kids by income, and the reimbursement structure to localities by free, reduced, and paid. And even though things have become more subtle, it's no longer tokens of different colors or tickets, that kids still know when a kid is eligible for free or reduced and paid meals. So, in looking just at some of the numbers, pre-universal, about 780,000 students at 75% were eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Of that number, about 250,000 students were not participating. So just to give some context, there's a lot of room for growth, and there are many reasons. The numbers drop off as kids get older, so it's about 80 to 90% in elementary. It goes to the 60% in middle school and down to the 30% in high school. And we know that the poverty stigma that's associated with the program in both schools where there's mixed income students and where most of the kids are poor has a big impact on participation as students get older. And this is not unique to New York City by any means. It's not unique to city schools. This is throughout the country. This is a problem that impacts participation. So the founders of our organization, Kathy Goldman, Agnes Molnar, have been fighting for universal free school lunch for 30 years. And when I joined, I have a background doing coalition building and coalition-based advocacy. And I was like, well, it can't just be the three of us sitting around trying to get this done. We have to bring together all the folks, and it can't just be the anti-hunger organizations, because politically that's not so interesting or so powerful. So there was an opportunity on the federal level with I never get the name of the bill correct, but under the Obama administration that incentivized doing universal free school lunch through a program called Community Eligibility Provision that localities could opt into. So we sat down and we were like, okay, what do we do here? With the Bloomberg administration wouldn't do it. We were like, okay, there was an election coming up. We got a commitment from all of the Democrats to do universal free school lunch. And we're like, okay, great. But we anticipated, where the budget piece comes in, is that we anticipated that it would cost the city roughly $20 million a year. And we were like, this is a completely worthwhile investment. The city should be doing this. Children aren't asked to pay based on, for teachers, for books, for classroom supplies, based on income, right? I mean, that's the notion of public schools, in theory, is that all kids should receive services regardless of income, the same services. So we got the commitment, including from the then candidate, Bill de Blasio, and at the same time, we started building up a creative coalition to try to bring together people who are unusual suspects together that would have an impact on this. Again, the core base were anti-hunger organizations, but we knew that going into this goes to Marissa's point about politics, going after 20 years of a Republican administration, we were likely to have a Democratic administration coming in, and we did with Bill de Blasio, that although he made this promise, there was going to be a lot of competition for progressive issues. So we thought about who needs to be involved in this. So we knew public school students, public school parents, the school-based unions, UFT, DC 37, who represent the cafeteria workers and other school staff, and the principals union, community organizations, a range of community organizations, academic institutions, and pediatricians. So we're trying to hit the health, education, food, parents, community, and we built a very powerful coalition that I'm happy to say is still going strong. And we thought, okay, this is like a no-brainer. This is a federally funded program. What's the challenge here? And although the city had kicked in for school food for quite some time, so that even that wasn't such a new notion. But with the competition of things, we realized we were getting some resistance. In addition, as we were building the coalition, we were like, okay, we have to pull in, there was a new city council coming in. A good number of new city council members were coming in. There was a new speaker, Melissa Mark Viverito, and they were looking for issues, as was the public advocate, Tish James. So we had conversations with them. We talked about the benefit of this and got their interest. Well, as things kind of to move things along, we actually had quite a bit of resistance from the previous chancellor, Carmen Farina. We were able to get universal free school lunch in middle schools in 2014, a year into our thing. I was disappointed because I wanted the whole thing, but it was fine. It was like, okay, as long as this moves us in the right direction. And we were like, we're coming at this from a collaborative approach. And then it stopped there. We thought there was a good increase in participation. It wasn't where we wanted it to be, but it was a good start. And instead of joining together to kind of keep things moving, she wanted to halt it. And after trying to work collaboratively to figure out next steps, we realized, okay, that strategy is not gonna happen. So it turned more adversarial. And we were fortunate that Tish James is public advocate, and then the city council took this on as their issue. And while frustrating and really puzzling why the mayor and the chancellor wouldn't want to move ahead with this, it was what it was. So we assumed the cost. It turns out when it was finally passed, we're actually bringing in $50 million more in federal and state revenue into the city for the city opting into community eligibility. So it actually it's not costing $20 million. It's actually bringing in more federal revenue. But for several years, we had to fight and figure out, how do we keep things fresh? How do we bring new things in? We always do analysis, both budget and participation analysis. We had the 3 powerful school-based unions involved. We have a very strong parent caucus. And the chancellor and the mayor kind of dug their heels in. Well, thankfully, as we were moving into a new election cycle, we were like, we have to get this done now, or we're gonna be in trouble. And thankfully, we were able to get it done, get it passed in 2017 in June. But just to give you an example of how politics and policy, so in June 2017, we were able to get the city with the council support to add almost all kids in total, because we had middle schools. They added another 450,000 kids. It cost them less than $1 million to do that. We had to twist their arms for that. And we knew there was no policy reason and no budget reason for that not to happen. It was that the chancellor did not want to do this. She was mad about it and she didn't want to do it. So we knew that. And once we saw the numbers, we were like, it was $0.9 million to expand to 450,000 children. Of course the city should do that. Well, we knew when that happened, you'd have most of the kids covered, that at some point that was going to turn over. And by September 2017, it was announced citywide universal. So that's, and just to wrap up, that we have our coalition is still going strong, and in terms of implementation, we know as an organization that's been doing policy and program work for many years, that you can't just get a good policy passed. You have to make sure you're watching, you're engaging, you're a partner with the agency, you're a watchdog with the agency. Like that's our role. So we continue to do that, and we've also, from our work, we're looking to build on the foundation of universal free school lunch, and we have other budget initiatives for the Lunch for Learning campaign that we're pushing forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So now, after hearing about a successful budget advocacy campaign, I want to move into a burgeoning budget advocacy campaign. I want to welcome Claire Raffel up to the stage. She's the Deputy Director at the Tisch Center for Food, Education and Policy Program and Nutrition at Teachers College, Columbia University. So, welcome.
Hi, I'm Claire, and so you've heard from three incredibly savvy and brilliant, policy people, and now you're going to hear from someone who is figuring it out with the help of lots of really smart people, many of whom are in this room right now. And I think I want to just make that really clear because I think this can sound incredibly complicated and scary and time-consuming, and it's possible to do it, and you don't have to be an expert, because I think I'm a good example of that. So I am at the Tisch Food Center at Teachers College. I'm not going to go too much into what we do. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to talk actually about two campaigns, city budget and state budget. We've had a win at the city side, and we're working on the state one. So we did research, my colleague Julie McCarthy is in here, there's 80 plus organizations that teach food, nutrition, education in New York City schools. And based on research that we did, we found that there's a huge inequity in who has access to this kind of opportunity and who doesn't in our schools, that nearly half of schools lack any of this kind of programming. And so, we worked with our colleagues to put out this research, and everyone was like, well, this isn't right. I mean, there's so many organizations, there's so much wonderful opportunities here. We need our kids to have this. What are we going to do about it? And so we joined with some of our colleagues and said, well, let's put on an event for the broader community. Let's talk about it. What do we want to organize? Do we want to build a coalition? What do we want to do? So just about a year ago, we held this summit at Brooklyn City Hall. We had 75 different organizations represented. We had parents, we had folks from community education councils, and there was a lot of energy to say, yeah, we want to do something. Let's organize. Let's form a coalition. We talked about what priorities might be, and as Marissa pointed out, this was heading into the budget cycle. And it turned out that there was a councilman, Raphael Espinal, who was really hot to trot on this. He wanted to do something. This is something he felt was super beneficial. He had funded in his district, and he was like, okay, tell me what you want, and I'm going to fight for it. So, this was where politics really, we were very fortunate in that. And so it was we went from 0 to 60, and we were like, okay, we need a budget priority. What the heck is our budget priority? So we came up with our vision, and we pulled together, based on what had been brainstormed in this summit, a number of budget priorities. And some were super pie in the sky, $200 million. And some were a lot less expensive. But and I'm not going to go through too many of them, except for to say, this is what we gave Councilman Espinal, and then started sharing as well with the Speaker's office, and sort of shopping around. We rallied. I know I shared a very silly picture of myself. Some of the folks in this room are also up here in vegetable costumes. So very effective, just as a strategy. We rallied. We actually had some legislation in the works from Councilman Traeger and Borough President Gail Brewer. We had an op-ed. We got Councilman Espinal to do some interviews. calling for $15 million. That sounds crazy, but I love what Jane's told us. Like, don't worry about the money. Just, ask for what you think is needed to bring equity for our students. We rallied again, this time particularly around the budget. And you know what? We got $250,000 this year in the budget, which for something that started in October and ended in June, I think I just give so much credit to my colleagues who are underfunded and under-resourced and over-committed and trying to do the best work they can for kids, that they actually saw policy and budget as a priority. They came together and got noisy, and we had our first success, and this is allowing us now to have some capacity. We were really bootstrapping this one to now be able to hire Julia McCarthy, who's sitting here, my colleague, and really start to build some real, put some meat on the bones of this coalition, bring in more folks, and think about what our future budget asks are. So, I think I need to also just acknowledge that Teachers College. I'm at an academic institution. Many academic institutions are not particularly supportive of their staff, just like going out and engaging in actual policy and politics. And Teachers College has been incredibly supportive of us. We've had access to Matt Camp, who's our government relations director, who's sitting back here, and our city lobbyists. So that matters, that academic institutions are willing to support real policy change. I think that's important to note. Okay, so that's the city budget. Now I'm going to talk about our state budget, which we have not had success with yet, but are in the works with. So, next up, we're going to continue to build our coalition. We're talking about our goals, and we're refining this year's budget priorities. More silly veggie picture. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the WELL campaign, the Wellness, Equity, and Learning Legislation campaign. At the same time, we put out this report on the state of food, nutrition, education in New York City schools. We had also put out a report. I think we're researchers, right? So we want evidence to build good policy priorities. And we had put out another report that Julia was also the first author on, called Empowered Eaters. And it was really looking at how is food nutrition funded and legislated at the federal, state, and local level. And then where are there opportunities to really ensure that all New Yorkers have access to these kind of opportunities of all ages, but particularly in schools, because that's our focus. And based on another coalition we were part of at the state level, which was to get farm to school funding increased in the state budget, we understood that piggybacking on an existing policy might be sort of the best place to start this. And that policy is wellness policy. So I'm going to talk about this campaign that we built, and we applied for and received funding from something called Voices for Healthy Kids, which if any of you are interested in state or local campaigns, it's a good source of funding to look at. They have specific budget priorities, and one of them happened to be school wellness. So, the statistics are just really shocking about the challenges our kids are facing. We focus on food, but in fact, this campaign has become really universally about kids' health and well-being. I'm not going to read these, but you can read them yourself. I just saw today that the CDC announced that child suicide rates have increased by 75% in the last 10 years. I mean, it's not okay. It's unacceptable. And our state is not doing enough. Thank you, 5 minutes. Our state just is not doing enough. We are not investing in school wellness, bottom line. In fact, we're like leaving federal dollars on the table for it. And we don't think that's okay. And so our campaign is proposing a solution to address that. Liz talked about the Obama Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Back in 2004, there was a law passed, so even before that, that every school district that is getting free federal meals for their kids needs to have something called a wellness policy. This is a USDA policy, so it's really more about like food and physical activity and making sure that kids have opportunities to eat good food and be active in schools. So every district has one, right? And it's a federal policy. And to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of them are like, here's our wellness policy, put it on the shelf. And so, again, we dug into the research. We looked at a representative sample across the state of these wellness policies and found that they're not very good. I mean, these are not grades you would want your kid to bring home on a test, right? They're not very strong. They're not very comprehensive. And probably even more shocking is that the vast majority of them aren't even in compliance with the federal rule. So they're not being taken particularly seriously. And it has nothing to do with school districts. It's not that they don't care about kids' health and well-being. They care deeply about it. It's that they don't have any support from the state to be able to help their kids. And so we happen to know from research that some of our colleagues in Chicago have done that when you have a state law that reiterates this federal law, that literally if you just have a law that says, hey, school districts, you need to have one of these policies, even if it doesn't give them any other guidance, it actually leads to better policies that are better implemented. So there's something about having that state law. 26 states have these and New York doesn't, which is crazy, right? We're supposed to be like the first and best in everything. And so all of this added up to us being like, we need to have one of these laws and let's actually be a leader in this and go a little bit above and beyond. So we built a coalition, a statewide coalition, and really tried to hit lots of different sectors. We are food people. We brought in physical education people and health education people, sex education people, folks who focus on farm to school and more of like on the education side, because health and education sometimes bizarrely don't really overlap. And these are our priorities. So this is what we asked for last year. Actually, we asked for less this year. We're doubling down this year. We're asking for more. But we launched. Speaking of timing, as Marissa did, we launched in October. So we were way behind the game. We basically had a logo, and that was it. And so we have a nice. We want New York State to pass a law creating a model state wellness policy. This would really, it wouldn't require districts to do more than they're already doing, but it would give them a framework. It would say, if your district is really struggling with mental health, here's language that you can incorporate in your wellness policy. If your district really cares about farm to school, here's language you can incorporate. The state is not providing any of that right now. And then we're asking for money. So the budget ask, in addition, we want to see this policy language in the budget, because in New York State, you can pass laws via the budget. In fact, something like 60% or something of laws are actually passed in the budget, which I had no idea about. We want someone at the state education department overseeing health and wellness. There is no one. There's not one single person. We used to have 30 people overseeing health education, which is a state mandate. Now there is one person who oversees vaccines. There's one person who oversees phys ed for all 732 districts in our state. There's no one. It's crazy. I mean, this is like a crazy thing. So we want a person to start with. And then we want $20 million that would go to the 205 highest need school districts. That's about $100,000 apiece to do what they need to implement their policies, because a policy is a piece of paper and you need resources to put it into action. So we've done all sorts of tactics and strategies. We've had press conferences. We meet with community groups. We travel around the state. I was just in Buffalo. We educate our lawmakers up in Albany. We've had some real success. We do have a bill in the assembly right now. It's a standalone bill, but it doesn't have the budget piece. And so we're hoping this year that it will just happen in the budget. We have a letter to the governor that we've had quite a few organizations statewide sign on to. And this is, if we're successful, this is what we want to see. This is the kind of opportunities we want for our kids, where they can be active and safe and supported and have great food and opportunities to really learn and thrive. So I invite you to be part of any of these opportunities. Certainly, if you're doing work in here in New York City and we haven't reached out to you about the Food Ed Coalition, please get in touch with us. I'm out of time. And I will say, for the Well campaign, also would love to have you can sign on to our budget letter to the governor. You can go on your phone right this very second and go to wellcampaign.org and either sign on as an organization or as an individual. We have a petition going to tell the governor this needs to be in the executive budget. And here's my contact info and Julia's contact info. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask our panelists to come up and have a seat on the stage. And we're going to jump right into audience questions. I have a few questions of my own. If we have time, we'll get to those. But I want to give audience members an opportunity to ask away if they have any burning questions. So if you have a question, we have 2 microphones floating around the room. Just raise your hand and they'll come around.
But the governor and, up until the last year or two, the legislature had sort of joined in wanting to try and do very politically popular tax cuts. So every year there would be one tax cut or another. So that's held down the ability of the state to be as responsive to growing needs as the city has. That said, barring a recession, and it does appear to be that the economy is slowing down, and that revenue growth might not be as great as it has been for the past 5 years. No one is projecting that there's going to be a decline or a downturn in the New York City or New York State economy. So for the time being, the revenue situation is holding up. What's very problematic at the state level is the governor's very conservative approach to budgeting. Since he took office in 2011, he's been very successful in getting the legislature to go along with an overall 2% spending cap. Now, its overall 2% spending cap, education aid and Medicaid, which together are a little bit more than half of the state budget, have been growing more than 2% a year, 4% a year on average. So every other part of the state budget has basically been level funded in many areas. And I've always done a lot of work with the human service sector, the nonprofit sector, and so on. The nonprofit sector has seen real cuts in state funding for many programs, less money to support the salaries of nonprofit workers, and so on. So there's more of a challenge at the state level, and I look forward to the day when the state legislature, throws out the 2% spending cap and gets the governor to allow the state to be responsive to compelling needs.
I would also just say that's also on both the city and state level, having that information is powerful, that, there is revenue, and in practice, you will always get pushback about large initiatives. You will always be told that there is no money. And there are a lot of conversations happening in the back end around larger economic development initiatives, like things that are costing billions of dollars. I mean, our city budget was $92 billion this year. Our state budget is $175 billion. When you're asking for $100,000, you're sort of like, that doesn't even show up, right? That's like an accounting error. So, but in practice, they will always say there's no money, or they will say to you, ooh, yeah, this is a really good idea, but do you want me to take that away? Like, I'm going to have to take it from someone else. And so they have made nonprofits and advocates feel like it's a zero-sum game. And so there's sort of a larger movement of folks being like, it's not a zero-sum game. Like, let's make the pie bigger for different initiatives. So I just would say that, like, I know that I don't have, like, the revenue chops to go in and talk to legislators the way that James does. So I could say, like, there is revenue, and it'd be like, how do you know? And I'd be like, I saw a presentation, and James told me. Like, so it's harder in practice to, like, really get responsiveness from elected officials.
Sorry, go ahead.
How do we get started with a pilot? I want a pilot. Yeah, they're like, do it, just do it.
Well, I've often thought that nonprofits should behave like the owners of sports teams. There's always money for a new stadium. They'll push and push and push for a new stadium, and yet, it's the sort of thing they never recoup the amount of money that goes into it. And yet, they successfully advocate for sports stadiums across the country all the time. So we have a question over here. The microphone's coming your way.
I wondered if you could talk, I don't think it's on.
It's just, I have to hold it really close to my mouth. I wondered if you could talk at all about the impact of the elimination of the SALT deduction on the state and local revenue, and whether that's done anything to affect the overall budgetary sort of framework, and whether that will also have an impact on the amount of federal aid that we can see going into some of the big programs that support these populations?
Yeah, so that's referring to the state and local tax deduction, where you can deduct on your federal taxes, state and local taxes. This was part of the Trump tax cut bill in 2017. Generally it's not good for New York City and New York State. It adds to the tax burden for many middle and higher income families. At the same time, many of the very highest income families benefited handsomely from other provisions in the tax cut bill, like the reduction in corporate taxes and so on. But generally, it's been a restraining factor on city and state budgets. But it's far from fatal. Hopefully, it will. The country will come to its senses at some point and reverse a lot of aspects, including the cap on the state and local tax deduction at the federal level. There was concern early on that this might lead high-income people who are affected by this to leave New York City or New York State. And there's quite a bit of research at this point that shows that that's a misunderstanding of the factors that lead people to locate where they are. So it doesn't look like there's been some big out-migration in the wake of that. New York City has a higher tax burden than the surrounding areas, and yet New York City's economy has been doing much better than the surrounding areas and much of the country. So there's the counter argument to be made that local governments that actually invest in infrastructure and public safety and public health and human services do better and thrive. Very similar to the argument about if you raise the wage floor for more people, and lo and behold, they require less reliance on on government supports. They're better able to take care of their own families and so on, and economies can grow as a result of that.
Thank you all for your presentation. The 2021 budget cycles in the city and state are going to take place with the backdrop of the 2020 election. And both the mayor and governor, and to some extent the city council and the legislature, seem to be wanting to distinguish themselves from the Trump policies and the Republican Senate policies. And I wonder if, particularly James and Marissa, but any of you have thoughts about how to frame budget arguments for the city and state for 2021 in the context of that national debate. What do you think are the effective frames for budget requests that would address the national election and the desire of the mayor and governor to be different?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is definitely doing your research. Over the last, since Trump has been elected, both the mayor and the governor have come out and touted how they are, New York City is a sanctuary city, even though it's not, that there's a lot of things happening in our state. The governor last year, I think he had his State of the State or his inauguration or something at LSI. They do a lot of things to say that they are against Trump's policies, and then in practice and in policy, they're not doing it. And so really knowing that and framing it in the way, using their words, like you said that you are a champion for immigrant communities. You said that you are a champion for Black and brown communities living in, low-income communities, and sort of, working with that of how can we help you get to what you said you're going to get to? I mean, there's a lot of things. The governor, his last election, he talked a lot about his justice agenda. So as the Senate became Democratic in the state, he said he was going to do 25 progressive things that have been on his plate and he had the ability to do for as long as he's been in office, and he has not. And so now that it passed because of the Senate, he took credit for all of it. And so really thinking about how you can make something a win for him without allowing him to get the power to take it away from you, and shift it and make it not good and then claim it as his win, which is what we saw with like solitary confinement reform. And so a lot of those things, and with the mayor as well, I mean, he's been beaten up, right? When he was running for president, like there was a lot of political things that occurred in the city. And so handing a win, you know, and convincing that like, if you pass this or if you make this a champion, this is, you know, the million people that are going to be like sing your praises and accolades. Like both of these folks have a lot of ego, and so it's just sort of like, how can you kind of package something up? That would be my personal feeling.
So,
Yes, you just have to hold it close.
okay. So, from our perspective, one of the things that we're working on is with CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute and the Food Chain Workers Alliance is the New York City Good Food Purchasing Policy campaign. And one of the ways that we've been talking about it and thinking about it is that this is a way to get New York City and potentially New York State, if we move in that direction, to use its enormous food purchasing power to counter some of the worst things happening on the federal level. So we think that that could add an additional oomph in terms of political appeal.
And I would just second what Marissa said. I mean, we're absolutely framing our letter to the governor was all about playing to his ego and saying, you had this wonderful No Child Hungry, you know, let's really double down on that. And you know, as the Trump administration is rolling back key provisions that would protect children's health and well-being, this is a time when you know, New York State can really step up and be a leader. So 100%. I mean, that was literally what our lobbyists told us to do. Like the two things, appeal, like make it seem like it was his idea, and invoke the Trump administration.
James, did you
over
have
and over and over.
James, did you have anything to add?
Just on the revenue side, both the mayor and the governor like to call themselves progressive. We recently saw the results of a study that indicate that for the first time ever, the 1%, or in particular the 400 richest people in the United States, pay a lower share of their income in all taxes, all government level taxes, than middle income and low income people do. Well, we can do something about that in New York by making our tax structure, local and state, less regressive, more progressive. And again, my priority in that area at the local level, which requires state action, is to make the property tax system less regressive. There's been a huge boom in luxury condo development in New York City. There's an amazing number of pied-à-terre apartments and townhouses owned by non-residents in New York City. We are seriously considering how we can level the playing field and make sure that the owners of those properties pay a fair share in property taxes. We would like to see Albany take the recommendations, which again, this is a commission appointed by both the speaker and the mayor. This will represent the consensus of New York City on property tax reform. We would like to see Albany consider that and say, this makes sense to us, you know, we approve, rather than try and muck that up and change it and have people who don't understand New York City property taxes, you know, act as if they do and make changes. Or even what we're most concerned about is that because there's a lot of support among conservative elements in the state to cap spending and to cap taxes. The governor has supported a very binding 2% state property tax cap. It's actually the lesser of 2% or inflation. And that's done a lot to hamstring local governments around the state, except New York City, where it hasn't applied. So we want to make sure that Albany doesn't muck with the recommendations that we make and avoid at all costs capping New York City property tax.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So one right there.
Thanks. On that point, what can advocates in this room do? And this is for all the panelists. What specific things can we do in this room to help put pressure to make that tax structure more equitable?
Well, I think certainly talk about the importance of both the city and the state level of a less regressive tax system. Hopefully within the next few weeks, the Property Tax Advisory Commission will issue some preliminary recommendations. There will be town halls in all of the boroughs. We will be actively trying to engage state legislators and city council members to get their support. So, it would be good to have people, monitor that to make sure that the discussion in Albany doesn't go in the direction of imposing a cap on New York City property taxes.
I would say, so in all of our trainings, we really emphasize that the state has the most power, right? New York City can pass a million bills, and at a whim, the state can pass a bill that just actually takes away everything that the city has passed. So what I would recommend for that is think about your statewide colleagues and folks that you're working with that are across the state, and have, these recommendations come from a bunch of regions, right? From all of the regions in the state. New York City is, there's a tension. I mean, we see the tension between Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, but there's also just a tension within legislators of policies that, the assembly is known as the downstate house because it's packed with New York City folks. And the state is really different. When you travel around New York State, the needs of kids, the needs of, the taxes, the political views, all of these things are really different. And so I would say if you're trying to move Albany, it's really key to go to different regions and make sure that whatever recommendations are being made are statewide, or at least that you have, 7 of the 10 big regions on board. Otherwise, it's just going to sit and be seen as a New York City issue. And those issues can be really tense, and those issues can be kind of cast aside because the legislators are trying to play politics and make everyone happy. Even our friends out in Long Island, it's different. It's politically very different. The folks are holding them accountable for very different things. There was a lot of backlash for a lot of the progressive legislation that passed this year in these different regions. They're afraid they're going to lose seats. So I mean, these things exist. So when you have something that really does impact folks differently across the state, really engaging in deep, authentic ways to understand how these policies would impact them, that's what I'd recommend.
Last question.
Stephen O'Brien, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Policy at Office of Food and Nutrition. Thank you to the panel. It was a great discussion. One question maybe it's great to end on this, is sort of longevity behind policy change. So when we got universal free meals, thanks to Liz and many others in the city advocating for that, it's always in jeopardy. So can you talk a little bit about how you maintain change? So, just yesterday, the mayor gave a press release about the fact that SNAP and benefits are being threatened from the federal level, and as a result, the city threatened to sue the Trump administration if they start to try to take away SNAP eligibility and change the rules. And as somebody inside the game, I understand that when a policy is made and there's a final change and there's a great benefit to the community that we're serving, that you have to really stay steadfast on making sure things don't start to get unraveled, as we're starting to see, especially with the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act and the standards, et cetera, being done through regulation change rather than through the normal process of public debate. So can you maybe touch on how you sustain change and how you have to stay vigilant even after you've made that adjustment?
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about universal free school lunch and what that means. And I think, as I mentioned before, one of the most important things is that policy change is good, but you need to make sure you are and have the staying power, knowledge, and resources to make sure that things are implemented well and continue to be. Like none of this, any of this work is a one-year thing. It's multiple years. It's constant vigilance. Politics change for the better and worse. There are opportunities, and then there are terrible things that happen. For universal free school lunch, just to give one example, that because SNAP benefits are being threatened, there's some risk to it shouldn't be framed as a risk to universal free school lunch in New York City, because it could have an impact on what's called direct certification, the number of students whose families get public benefits. But what that would mean if we have the commitment from the city, and part of what we hoped when we got universal at that time is once you do it, it's pretty hard to reverse it on a city level, just politically. So it might mean that the city would have to put some money into it. It doesn't mean the city would have to reverse its policy. It may be that we're now bringing in, because all of the meals are reimbursed at the highest rate from pre-universal to now, an additional $50 million in federal and state funds. So it may be that that number goes down, or the city has to kick in money. We've always had the position that even if it costs the city money and there wasn't a federal option, that New York City should provide universal free school lunch. So we hold steady to that. What we need to do or think about in terms of figuring out if there is legislation that should go behind it is an additional story, I should say.
Right. I think to that point, looking at state and local policy as a backstop to policies that from the federal government that do seem to be in jeopardy is one strategy. This is sort of a different angle on it, but I also think, I mean, what Liz said is that it's never ending and it is resource intensive. And I really think all of us who work in nonprofits and work with funders need to encourage them to think about funding advocacy and not be so scared of it. And funding it is a long-term investment. I mean, I'll tell you, the grant that we got for this campaign is a one-year grant. What does that even mean? Who passes state policy in 1 year? That's ridiculous, you know? And really investing in it on the long term and understanding that, you know, some of these issues will never go away. We're probably never going to have to stop fighting to keep SNAP intact. And that funders really need to think about how to invest in that capacity for the long term. If there's any funders in this room, that's for you.
All right, I think we will leave it there. Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you to our panelists. And I just wanted to plug again our upcoming forums, November 19th, Urban Food Policy Forum, Building Business Bridges, Urban Rural Food Dynamics, 6 to 9 p.m. at Baruch College, and on December 17th from 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. here at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, 50 years after the White House Conference on Food and Nutrition, SNAP, in and after the Trump era. Hope to see you there.
And on November 9th, we're doing an advocacy training at Teachers College. It's free. So look at TC Advocacy. tc.edu/advocacy, and you can actually get some hands-on.
Thank you.